Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me this morning for our session on grants for small businesses. My name is Kristy Bailey. I'm a presenter and an advisor for Business Station as part of the Digital Solutions Commonwealth Government Program. I have also personally applied for and successfully received more than 10 grants for my own and other small businesses. So we're going to go through some key info on grant funding today and why it exists. But also how you can maximise your efforts with the hope of obviously getting success by way of applying for grants. So a lot of that is going to be drawn on my past experience. So please do feel free to ask questions at any time. Now, you can do that through the Zoom chat or the Q&A functionality. So pop any questions in as we go, and then I'll stay on for a few minutes at the end and answer any questions that you might have as well. Okay, so getting straight into it. First of all, what are the grants and what other support is available from the government? Well, most grants are in fact available from a state government or at a state government level, but there are also federal grants. There are also grants that are available through other smaller regions like local government areas or shires and that kind of thing. It really just depends on the area in which you operate. But essentially, government grants are normally for specific projects, so they're not just generally for business. You'll always need a specific plan to be eligible and not just a general business concept. So we'll go through what that might look like, but do keep that in mind. Now, there are a few exceptions to this. There are some grants that are specifically for starting a business, and that they will come around from time to time, depending on the industry again. And there's grants for business activities like expansion, for training, research and development. There's always grants that are available in that area, importing and exporting, commercialising a specific product idea, plus a lot more. So the government offers a lot of other support by way of small business. Now, that can be in the form of free and low-cost business advisory services, similar to the Digital Solutions program that we're presenting this webinar to you on behalf of, but also financial and tax support or advice, loans and other support. So a lot of government assistance does take this form aside from just grant funding. So keep that in mind. There's also networking, there's coaching, there's mentoring. So that's all considered government assistance as well. And sometimes that can actually be more important than winning grant money on some levels, particularly if you're looking at the sustainability of your business and that ongoing development of your business. I would certainly be taking advantage of that other support that the government offers. Now, in terms of grants and this support, these sort of areas exist so that small businesses can achieve the government's economic and social policies of generally a thriving economy is always going to be one main objective. To reduce unemployment and to build stronger communities. So they tend to be the three things that the government is looking to achieve, and small businesses are the way in which they can achieve that. So support allows you to carry out the functions that the government actually needs to make the economy function well. Now, before you start looking at opportunities, you absolutely have to determine if you're grant ready. Grant success is directly correlated to business success. So you have to have a strong business plan. You have to have a strategy in place, both a business and a marketing strategy, to make sure that you can effectively answer the application questions in the first instance. To be able to answer those questions, you have to have an intimate knowledge of your business plan as well, and be able to pick out core components of that, because, as I said, a lot of grant funding is project-based. You have to know how that strategy is going to be implemented and make sure that you actually have the resources to implement that strategy. And you should have developed a really clear understanding and have some good quality proven research on how this strategy or this project is actually going to succeed. Now, the value of a grant is because it enables business success. So the true test of your strategy is going to be that it's going to deliver that specific outcome of the government or of the funding body. So that outcome is dictated by the grant. So you've got to perfectly align what your project idea or your business concept is with what the objectives are. And you'll hear me repeat that quite a bit today. because it is the key element of grant success. It's really having direct alignment with the government or the funding body's objective and your project. Okay, so before you even get started, there's a few things that you'll need to consider. First of all, the things that you absolutely need are an ABN. You have to be operating in the state that is providing the grant, and sometimes in the shire or the local government area where the grant is relevant to. You should have any relevant licenses or approvals, or have a knowledge of how you can obtain them, or a proof that you can actually get licensed to operate in that specific area if it's a startup business. You will have a defined target market. That's really important. You have to know exactly who your customers are. And there should be some research behind that as to proven demand, consumer demand. Otherwise, the government will really struggle to fund something that is not going to be successful, that's not going to turn over any revenue, of course. In some cases, you will also be required to have proof of matched funding. They'll be very clear with that on the outset, whether or not it is that sort of circumstance where proof of matched funding is required, or if it is if it's in fact 100% grant funded, that will be clearly stated. So in the case that it is matched funding and you are required to have, sometimes it's 50% matched funding, sometimes there's one available at the moment where you're only required to put in 20% and they'll commit the other 80%. So whatever that might be, they will clearly state that in the grant communications, and proof may be required of your contribution. Okay, what's the funding for? Well, grants are really widely used to achieve those government policy objectives that I mentioned. Now, the billions of dollars each year is paid to the non-government sector for small business, just like yours, to achieve those government objectives. And it benefits the public ultimately, and that is through increased social services, expanded opportunities for businesses. Sometimes it's emergency relief or research and innovation. So it is all for the benefit of the public ultimately, and they're just using small business as the conduit to actually achieve those goals. But depending on where the funding is coming from, those objectives will vary, and they'll be very clear with their objectives. But in all cases, are realistic projects that have a strong and dedicated backing and have a high likelihood of success, as described in the application, are going to be a lot more favourable from a grant assessor's perspective. Now, I would consider a few elements when you're deciding to submit an application. First of all is whether or not you have the financial capacity to undertake the project. Now, this, in the case of a matched funding, that's obviously really important. In the case that the grant only covers a certain amount and you have to make up the difference, that's obviously important as well. So you have to understand what the total cost of the project is, and therefore, what the total outlay is going to be and how much of that you're going to actually be funded. If you have the resources needed to deliver the project is another consideration. Now, resources, I mean, in terms of the actual application process, it can be extremely long-winded. It can take a lot of time, and it is almost a project. It's a project in its own right. So you need that sort of project management type approach. So having those resources is really important, but then also to deliver the actual project. The application in the first instance is important, but then the resources to actually deliver the project in the timeframes and hit those milestones that you've actually stated in your application will be crucial. You have to consider if the project is consistent with your overall business strategy as well. That's a really, really key thing, because some people see grant funding and go, all right, well, there's money there, so I'll try and create a project that I can then get funded. But if it's diverting away from your overall business strategy and the core of what your business is, it might actually detract or distract you as a business owner from your core business. So it can have detrimental effects if you're too focused on a project purely for the sake of sourcing funding. The time I touched on, you have to have the time just for the application process alone. And also the eligibility requirements are a key consideration. So you need to have a look at those first and make sure that you are in fact eligible before you spend any time on the application. And in all cases, if you do meet all of those considerations, so you've had a look at all of those elements, you go, yeah, we can do this. You then also have to weigh up the risks and the opportunities. So what is the risk to the business to actually undertake this? And again, like I said, does it take you away from the core function of your role or distract you from other elements of your business versus what is the opportunity? Just because there's funding there doesn't mean that you have to apply for it. So that would always be a consideration as well. Okay, so assuming you found a suitable grant and you're looking into it further to decide if you're going to apply, there are further considerations. I touched on eligibility. You do have to thoroughly look at the eligibility criteria and make sure your business meets this. Now, this could be things like determining what type of organisation the funding body is looking to fund, and a range of other key eligibility criteria. So keep that in mind. I would suggest that you should read through and have a thorough read through of the guidelines, the process requirements, and the application forms. Read it start to finish. Some of it you won't be able to answer because it'll be part of the application, but just understand all elements. You don't want any surprises when you get to the 10th document, if that makes sense. So just read it, read everything available to you. Including the supporting information. So download all available supporting information. Now, this will be things like terms and conditions. There could be frequently asked questions. In some cases, there's application tips and hints and that kind of thing. So download everything that you have available to you by way of grant application support and thoroughly read that as well. Throughout this process, you'll be determining what the funding body is looking to achieve, and you need to make sure that your project can satisfy those objectives. So you'll keep referring back to those objectives right through the application process, but it's really important. Don't just read them once and go, yeah, my project does that. You have to really highlight that through the application process and link back to the objectives so that you're clear to the assessor that your project will actually deliver on the core objectives of the funding. Don't be afraid to ask questions or seek clarification from the funding body. Now, generally, there is a period of time that you can go through and ask questions, so definitely make use of that. You might want to sort of go through and highlight key dates and deadlines like, the question period and those kind of things. So definitely make use of that. I find that's really helpful if sometimes they have sessions, open sessions where you can ask questions, online, and other businesses that are applying for grant funding are there asking questions, and you can learn a lot from the other questions that are being asked as well. There could be briefing or information sessions, and this is where a representative is actually delivering verbal information on the grant funding. So that can be really helpful as well. Just having someone interpret what's written and verbally sort of communicate that to you can be really helpful. And in the instance of briefing or information sessions, sometimes you do get questions from other applicants as well that can help you. So it might have been something that someone thought of, you hadn't considered that as a question yet, but they've asked it and it's relevant. So that extra information can really, really help your application. In terms of preparation, you do have to make sure that you're well and truly prepared for just the application process. Now, some things that you would have to take into consideration at this point are time. Time is the major factor. You have to allocate sufficient time. Don't expect that you can do it all last minute because you won't be able to. It is a difficult process and it requires a lot of back and forth. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but definitely don't expect that you can do that last minute at the quality or the high level that you would do it at if you were more planned. I would also recommend that you treat the process as a project and have a bit of a team approach if you can. I would get together some core people within your business. Now, you might be writing the grant application, but it doesn't hurt to sort of flesh out some ideas with other people. Have a bit of a brainstorm, get some input from other team members. because how you interpret, again, a government document or a set of government documents may vary to how someone else interprets it, and just a different opinion on even the objectives alone will really help you. But just fleshing out that project idea, I think, is great. You have to identify the people who you'll need to have, you will require, I should say, to have input into the application. So it's a who does what kind of thing. There will be the plan and the strategy development. There could be document design and presentation. Sometimes your grant applications are purely done through an online portal, whereas other times you do need to lay them out and sort of present them really well. You might be having, different people collate information and then someone bring it all together and write it. You'll need bookkeepers and accountants to provide statements and information. So there are a lot of people that should have input to a grant application. In normal circumstances, you wouldn't try and take it all on yourself. You would reach out to different people just to share the load a little bit, share the opinion on things and the interpretation on some of the documentation. But also, once you've identified who does what, you can really then assign a time. So it could be something as simple as, financial statements from a bookkeeper or an accountant. You've identified, because you've read all of the grant application documents, you know that you need that by a certain date. You don't have to do anything other than go to that bookkeeper or accountant and say, get me this information by this date, please. That keeps them, that gets their side of the project underway while you're busy doing other things. So identifying early who does what can be really helpful. I would also say that you should keep very good records of all information required. So make yourself a bit of a checklist and set deadlines for those people that are required to get things back to you. Set deadlines for yourself as well, so that you know when you have to achieve key areas of the grant application too. Okay, the info gathering side of things, I've touched on this when I mentioned getting a team together and reaching out for information, but it is a really key part of the application process. There's going to be those documents that may take time to get because you have to request them from an accountant or even, another third party. So this isn't hard work as such, but you don't want to be caught out at the last minute because you're relying on someone else to get you something. So absolutely gather your internal and external inputs early in the process and collate the information that you require. Now, information that you might require will be a range of things. First of all, from a legal side of things, it could be things like your corporate details, insurance certificates of currency, your ASIC and business name registration certificates or documents like that. Sometimes you'll need referees or written testimonials. Sometimes you'll have brochures and marketing literature that you'll need to provide examples of. There could be policies, procedures, work instructions, even things like ISO certifications that may take time for you to actually achieve that to be eligible to actually submit the grant application. So that legal side of things is really important. Licenses and permits will be really important as well. So keep that in mind. If there's anything you need to apply for or research that you need to do on what sort of licenses are required, you'll need to consider that as well. Key personnel CVs could be something that you need to supply. Now, in a lot of cases, they'll want to know who's behind a project. And so sometimes a CV is actually really relevant for, the key leads in certain projects, or even to really establish your business credibility or your personal credibility in relation to the project. You generally input some of your business plan and your marketing plan, but at the very least, you'll have a description of your business, but your business plan and your strategic marketing plan should be specific to the project. So keep that in mind. Your budget then will be a proposed budget, which is really just a plan on how this grant funding is going to be used. And then the defined project side of things will be your project description. Now, this will include the aims and objectives of your project, which will directly link back to the objectives of the grant and of the funding body. So you have to make sure that aligns. The third step to that is to make sure that the budget aligns. So you've got the funding body's objectives, you've got your project description and the objectives, aims and objectives of the project. They should be directly aligned. And then your budget should account for everything that's mentioned in that project, which would be aligned directly with the objectives, of course. So always keep referring the three. So you might get, and I've done this many of times, where you start sort of writing a project description and you go, no, I think I'll change that and I'll add a few things. And then next thing, your project's kind of changed a little bit. And then you've got a budget that sits alongside that because the project's changed, the budget's changed, but then you go back to the objectives of the grant and go, hang on a second, the grant is actually for the purpose of this, this, and this. Go back to the drawing board, change your project description and the aims and objectives of the project, and then the funding, then the budget, etc. So always link those three things together. Now, budgeting, when it comes to this side of it, you have to be really careful, because if you're successful, you'll have to spend the funds as you've outlined in that budget. So you'll need to complete an accurate outline of your program or your project costs and make sure that each item is eligible under the grant that you're applying for as well. So first of all, you have to understand the funding body's requirements. So before preparing your project, you'll have to check, the format that they actually require the budget to be submitted in. Some funders will allow you to use your own budget template. Others will provide you with a template that incorporates their budget, and others will it'll just be a fill-in format online. So there'll be a few variations. In all cases, I would recommend that you actually submit or you actually complete your budget in something like an Excel document, so that you've got your own hard copy of it. You can then translate it over to an online fill-in format if that's the format that they choose. As you're doing this, really consider what type of expenses are eligible. So as part of the grant funding or the supporting information, it'll tell you about eligible and ineligible project costs. So always make sure if you're including a cost that it is an eligible cost. I would also consider that you may need to work with other people to determine costs. So you may need to get quotes for various things, work with your own team members. There could be suppliers that are running your program or your project, and you really have to estimate their anticipated needs of the project and associated costs with that. Where you have to be really careful is again, through understanding the grant dates and deadlines and overall, grant information, you'll see that the funding can be used. There will be a start date and an end date. So let's say, you're submitting the application now, but your project cannot start until 1st of July, and it has to be completed by 31st of December. So you're getting a quote now in April for something that can't start to July. It's really important that your supplier understands that this project will be carried out in July, and that the quote is valid for that period of time. What you don't want is to create an amazing project, apply for the funding, be successful in the funding, accept the funding, then go to engage all of your suppliers, only to find that the costs have completely changed. In the case that they have completely blown out or increased, the government aren't going to give you more money. They're not going to say, okay, well, your things change, we'll give you a little bit more. It's going to be you that's going to have to fund the difference. So really keep that in mind. Now, in terms of, I guess increasing your chances of getting this across the line and being successful with these grant applications, always make sure that your grant budget is consistent with the objectives, like I said, and with your project. So there's 100% consistency throughout all three. And check for anything in your project description. So if you've mentioned any words or anything in your project description, make sure that you have reflected it in the budget. I would absolutely consider your direct costs for grants. So that's the funds that you're actually asking for. It could be personnel or staff costs, travel. There could be purchase of equipment, supplies. Now, if there's supplies, break it down into categories. You might want to factor in-kind contributions or volunteers, or there could be other indirect costs like your overheads and lease costs and that kind of thing. Now, in terms of the budget, if you do provide a high quality budget as part of your grant application, it really does increase your likelihood of getting approved or getting, your grant application across the line. It makes it a lot easier for you then to actually carry out the project, because you can do that line by line, and you'll know exactly how much you can spend for each element as well. It also really helps you to prepare an accurate grant report at the other end of the project when it's time to report back to your funder. So keep that in mind as well. There's that element to it where you will have to report on everything that you're talking about. Just also keep in mind that preparing your grant budget is not the same as your normal operating budget. This is all going to be 100% project specific. So I would really consider that as well. Now, in terms of some budget do's and don'ts, there are some key things to look out for here. First of all, don't request more than the maximum amount available, because it might in fact make your application completely ineligible. It will also indicate to the panel or the assessors that you haven't read the guidelines properly. I wouldn't expect a grant to pay for your entire project. Generally, there will be additional contributions from other sources that are expected. Now, that could be in-kind support. It could be contributions from your own business. It could be generated income like sales or fees. It could be other grant funding you can actually use towards the project, or things like sponsorships and donations. But don't expect, and I've probably seen one or two in the past where the grant covers an entire project. Do read all of the explanatory notes that are included in the budget section of your application form, and any other info that's provided. So they're intended to guide you in the completion of the budget. They provide examples of the types of income and expenditure items that you can include. Like I said, I would be doing a draft budget and I would do that in Excel or somewhere in your own sort of file and format before you transfer it to the actual application form. Just keep in mind, if you're tweaking things and adjusting things and you've already sort of half submitted online and you're then tweaking in your original document, make sure that you're translating across the two, and just always recheck your total amounts. Generally speaking, you do not include GST in your budget figures. They'll clearly outline this in the guidelines, but yeah, 99% of the time they're GST exclusive. Do certainly estimate the in-kind support. So in-kind support is non-cash items that are donated to your project, essentially. You'll only be able to provide estimates of their actual value, but they are important because they do show the real cost of the project. Certainly do contact the funding body for guidance in completing your budget. Now, this is separate to guidance just on the application process. This is budget related items. If there's something you're not sure about and you go, oh, should this be covered? Is this eligible? Is it not? Just ask the question, because you don't want to, find that your whole submission is let down because you put a couple of ineligible things in there just for not checking. I would recommend that you do the expenses section of the budget first. Now, be realistic about what you ask for or what you account for here in your expenses. Certainly don't underestimate the time and the cost of the project. But likewise, don't inflate your costs, because assessment committees look very carefully at budgetary issues. They are looking for value for money, and a lot of grant applications will actually state that they're looking for projects that represent good value for money. It's an investment on their behalf, and it's an investment for you to achieve their objectives. So again, just make sure that it is good value. Assess your time that you've got to input into this. Definitely approach suppliers to get their costs and their availability, and get quotes, and make sure the quotes are valid for the period of time that the project's actually going to be undertaken, not just valid, for 10 days from the time of the quote or something like that. Definitely assess if there's any travel or accommodation and living allowances, cost of materials and equipment hire. Once you've done the expenses, then you can do the income. Now, income is going to be how much you can apply for this particular grant. Think about any in-kind support you could source, any cash donations and sponsorship opportunities or earned income. Think about what you as a business or personally can afford to actually contribute to the project as well. There might be confirmed or unconfirmed income from other grants for the project as well. So they will state in the eligibility if you can use other funding towards that project. But keep in mind, expenses first, then your income, and your budgets must always be balanced so that the income does equal expenditure. So if you have completed your budget and it balances, that's absolutely perfect. You're on to the next step. But if not, you'll need to go back and find out why it doesn't balance and get it to balance. And just keep in mind, and I've said it a million times, that any item on your budget has to link back to the description of your project and the objectives of the grant. So what I normally do by way of budget is put down kind of like a wish list. If you spend anything, this is what it would look like, and then start to scale it back until you get it to balance based on what you can input and what the grant funding is going to cover. So that working backwards helps for me, but you might have a project that's well defined where the costs are the costs. Okay, in terms of writing responses, I'd always recommend that you write in accordance, obviously, with the application guidelines, answering the specific questions and thoroughly reading those questions is really the key thing. So understand the question. You can read a question and not read it properly and write an amazing answer, but if you haven't understood the question, it won't be relevant at all. So I would always go back and read those questions in depth over and over again. And that's where I think it's good to get a team involved and understand the questions together. So how do you interpret this question? Everyone has some input on that. And, this is how I think I'd answer it. What do you think? That kind of teamwork will really help you. Always provide clear and detailed descriptions of how the proposal is going to be implemented, as well as a description of the organisation. So really establish your business credibility early on in the piece and your qualifications for actually, getting the funding. With the project side of things, really clearly define the aims and objectives again, and outline how the objectives are going to be achieved. Also outline how the success of the program is going to be measured. So that's really, really important. So being clear and detailed is absolutely crucial. Linking your proposal again back to the community or the target group benefit is really important. I would be thinking about things like the long-term benefits of the project to not only to your business, but to the community by way of creation of jobs, preservation of existing jobs in that particular regional area, or how the project's going to benefit the target group that is relevant to the objectives as well. You can identify and sort of demonstrate an awareness of the specific needs of that target group or of the community as well throughout your actual application. There should be evidence that you could supply or up-to-date or accurate data based on your research about that target group, the needs, to determine that this project is actually going to be successful, like I said earlier. I would always write factually. Of course, the information that you submit has to be accurate, and it could be audited, and quite often they are audited. So you should be bold, you should be positive, but you shouldn't be exaggerating claims or anything like that. Anywhere that you can provide evidence to support the application is going to really strengthen it. So if you're saying that there's demand for this and you know this through research, then state what the research is, not referencing like you would do in a academic sort of sense, but just definitely backing up what you're saying with hard evidence. So it's not I believe or I think and those kind of things. Again, show and repeat that link to the funder's objectives. Now, the other thing that you can do in terms of when you're writing your responses and sort of defining your project is check websites and annual reports to get a feel for what's likely to be funded or what has been funded in the past. A lot of times, depending on the grant, they have been through multiple rounds and they're not just a one-off. So you might be able to see what kind of things did well in the past or what kind of organisations actually secured funding. So definitely do that as part of when you're writing your responses. Okay, in terms of writing style, Set out your document structure so that it's in the same logical sequence, using the same headings as the application information. In the case that it can be a written sort of your own format response, sometimes it's going to be online. So you're literally answering questions in a box that tells you how many characters or how many words you've got to use. But no matter what you're doing, making sure that you're clear in your answers. Being succinct in your answers is going to really help as well. That simple, concise language where you're not waffling, you're not repeating the same sort of sentences over and over again will always do well. Always keep in mind that somebody has to read your application, and they're probably reading a lot of other applications as well. Most of the time it's a panel, so it's not an individual that's saying yes or no, but there's a few assessors and they're all reading, a ton of applications. So that's a really key thing as well. Always consider that there is a real person at the end of it, so make it enjoyable for them to read. Your title is quite important. A short project title that's creative or interesting, and your description of aims and objectives, like in a bit of an executive summary, will do well in the case that it's free format. If it's not free format and you're actually submitting it online, you won't get that opportunity. You'll just be filling in where they tell you to. Throughout your application, don't hesitate to repeat key messages where it's relevant. That's kind of using more persuasive techniques. You have to reinforce the message to the assessor to make sure those key messages are received well. But make sure that you're articulating them well too. Now, one thing I don't like to see if I'm ever reading any kind of application is the same paragraph or the same sentence just repeated over and over again. That's not so much persuasive techniques. That's just more, possibly a bit of laziness in terms of cut and paste. But if you have to say the same message, just tweak the words and the way in which you say it. So you are repeating it, but you're saying it in different ways. And it's relevant to the section that you're answering that particular item in. You will always have to have a professional layout. Things like consistent fonts are really important. If you're using graphics and tables or photos and charts and diagrams, it breaks up that content a little bit. Headings with subheadings and shorter paragraphs make it a lot easier to read from an assessor's perspective. Your bullet points, and consider your margins and layout designs where you've got the opportunity to free format. And in most cases now, and most grants are moving towards that online fill-in format. So none of that's really relevant, but in the case that it is more of a free format, definitely consider those sort of professionalism aspects. Also, throughout your document or throughout your application, don't use vague or speculative words. And I did touch on this, like I believe, I hope, I feel. Those kind of things are all a bit vague. I would be basing it on factual statements with evidence to back them up. Okay, some do's and don'ts, just to sort of wrap up on that. First of all, on the do's perspective, do tailor your application for a specific grant. Each has a different criteria that you have to meet and is designed for a specific purpose. So your application needs to be specific to all of those. So do keep that in mind. You might get to a point where you're writing lots of grant applications, which is fantastic, but always tailor them. Do address all questions and all eligibility criteria, answer every question. You have to be succinct yet thorough. And answer all components of all questions. So if you're unable to answer a specific question on a grant application, then that usually means that you're actually not suited to that grant or not ready to apply for that particular grant. So don't guess, don't leave it blank. Make sure you either get yourself informed or come back and consider it next time when you are able to answer that particular section. Definitely do have a grant strategy. It helps to know what grants you're eligible for ahead of time. It allows you to kind of maybe plan projects around that. You would never plan a project on the basis that you're guaranteed a grant, because there's no guarantees, but it could give you some good ideas of when to start a project. One thing you wouldn't want is to have an amazing project that is something that's, likely to achieve some core government objectives, start it, then find out there's a grant application available, because in most cases the grants will say you can't have started this project until after the grant funding has been announced. it also means if you do have that grant strategy, it means that you can map out your application timeline and systematically address each grant as well. So you have enough time for each grant application. Do consider specific projects instead of the business as a whole. And I touched on this in the beginning. In most cases, grants are awarded for specific business activities, like, you know, your product development, your importing or exporting agreements, staffing and training, that kind of thing, rather than just running your business. Technology grants, you know, there's lots of those kind of grants as well. But you're not going to get a technology grant just because, you know, it's a new business. It's going to be because it meets a specific criteria. So in all cases, consider that criteria. Don't apply for grants that you're unlikely to get. A proper grant application takes so much time, and hopefully you can sort of gauge that from our conversation today. I wouldn't be wasting that time and effort just applying for things that you're not really likely to get anyway. So be really careful with that. Don't assume that just having a good startup with a good idea is enough, because it's absolutely not. So once again, grants and government business assistance is generally awarded for the fulfillment of specific requirements that do vary between grants. So having a good idea is not generally one of them, or having a good business idea is normally to obviously achieve those objectives. The last point there is don't not follow up. There's a lot of startup and small business grants available. It is possible that grant applications will become a really regular part of your operation. So think about the long term, follow up on grants, even if you're not successful. The grant administrator might be able to provide you with some great feedback on how you can improve for next time, how you might have better addressed certain eligibilities, or what they felt went wrong. In some cases, grants are a competitive process. So that means there's only a certain amount of money that can be awarded. So whilst your project is good and you answered your application very well, because there's only a limited amount of money, they've had to sort of prioritize that. So that kind of feedback is really helpful as well. You don't want to think that you bombed out on your application only to find it was the fact that, you know, there wasn't enough money to go around. Now, you can use a professional grant writer, and that can potentially improve your chances. It can save you a bit of time, and they can sort of help you with a more of a complex grant strategy. But do your homework here. I also believe that you can very much apply for grants yourself. If you do look at a grant writer, ask about their experience and what sort of industries they work with. It could be helpful to get a grant writer that actually specialises in your industry as well. So that kind of thing is really important. Shop around, get different prices as well, and go with what you're most comfortable with. But also keep in mind that you're going to have to give significant input to that grant writer. So they're not going to know the history of your business, the project. So all of those kind of things, they're going to be the writer at the end of the day, but they're going to lean on you for a lot of information. So it's not a complete handball to get a grant writer. You still have to have significant input in that process. And you want to, because you want to shape that application. Okay, some final tips. Grant writing isn't easy, especially when you've got this large application process, and it does require a lot of information, a lot of supporting documentation. There's evidence. The more you do it, the easier it will be. So do keep that in mind. But in terms of those final tips, definitely make it easy for the assessor and make it engaging for the assessor. So like I said earlier, there's a grant, someone that's reviewing this grant, who has to assess a lot of different applications. So if you've got a nice, clear application that really sets the scene for them, you've got a bit of enthusiasm, you're driving points home and really standing out amongst other applications with evidence-based information, it will stand out. But in saying that, you do have to write for someone that may not know your industry, may not know your region. So you do have to establish that clear picture of who you are, but you have to do it clearly and concisely. Don't lose your passion as such, but do get straight to the point, because you don't want to get into that trap where you're telling them every detail from the moment you thought of the business idea right till, you know, where you are at this moment in time. You've got to really be able to concisely and clearly summarize that. But engaging and making it engaging is going to really help. Answer all questions in full. That's really important. Like I said, if you can't answer a question for whatever reason, it probably means you're not ready for that specific grant application. Once you've completed your application, if you have got through all the steps that we've spoken about, make sure you revise the application and do it a lot. Your goal is to develop that clear and concise application that communicates your project or idea effectively, passionately. Don't bomb out on spelling or grammatical errors, or be waffling a little bit. Things like that can really hinder that overall application. Get someone to review it for you. A fresh set of eyes will really help and identify any of those little things. Definitely give it to someone for a bit of editing right at the end and get their feedback, and then rewrite components if you need to. And that sort of ties in with submitting ahead of time. I would not only have it completed ahead of time so that you can get someone to revise it, but submit the actual application ahead of time. Don't leave it to the last minute. There's always unexpected errors in terms of, there could be something technical, technological. Stress can play absolute havoc, and you can miss things because you're rushing to make a deadline. Platforms can go down because lots of people are trying to upload information at the same time. So all of those things can really play a huge part in the success of your application. So make sure that you are well prepared. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the specific grants and where you can find more information. So keep in mind, as I said right at the beginning, grants are mostly match funding. There's also rebates, there's subsidies, there's incentive schemes, there's training and development, there's advisory and mentoring service, low interest loans, and a range of other things. So in terms of grants, some of the things that are available at the moment, there's a lot around the COVID piece. Now, these aren't your true grant applications in terms of you have a project, you describe that project. This is more, there's lockdown assistance, there's hardship grants, there's those kind of things where you're just really providing factual information of, this is what happened to me, this is the economic impact, this is the area I operate in, and applying for funding. So things like the COVID assistance, whether it be hardship or lockdown, they're generally region specific, definitely state specific in most cases. There were some that were national, but obviously we're sort of past that point now. And each state will have varying information. So I haven't gone into too much detail on that. There's, anytime Perth has had a lockdown or Western Australia's had a lockdown, there's been assistance to small businesses that have been impacted. There's hardship grants available at the moment in different local government areas, as well as in WA as a state. Queensland has different things going on, as does the NT. So always have a look out for what might be relevant from a COVID perspective in your state. EMDG is the Export Market Development Grant. Now, this is up to 50% off eligible export promotion expenses. Normally, it's above $5,000 or when you've spent over $5,000, and it's for new and current exporters. So EMDG, it's an Australian government financial assistance program for exporters. Normally around 4,000 businesses, and small to medium businesses, take advantage of it. It has recently changed, so it's a lot more flexible and it's responsive to the needs or the changing needs of exporting businesses. So previously it was retrospective funding, but now it's upfront funding. So it gives you that greater certainty that you specify the amount that you want to be funded over 2 or 3 years. You apply for it, and then you are hopefully awarded with it. So it has become a lot more simpler. And it has expanded and to help those people that are looking to export for the first time or become export ready as well. So keep in mind, an interesting thing on that, if you are a tourism business, bringing visitors into the country is considered export. So it's not just sending products outside of Australia as well. The Small to Medium Enterprise Recovery Loan Scheme. Now, that was government grants being provided on loans. So these loans were either secured or unsecured. So you still applied for it through your bank. Now, that was due to end of the year. So end of last year, 31st of December 21. They then extended to 30th of April. I haven't heard of any further extension on that. So cutting it very fine to get that in if you haven't already. There has been the Boosting Female Founders. Now that has been through 3 rounds, and everyone's sort of eagerly awaiting the potential 4th round or 3rd round of it, which hasn't been announced yet. So whether or not that will be, that sort of remains unseen. But that is it's essentially funding for growth for small businesses that are owned by females, or at least 51% female owned and led. So keep that in mind. That one's really interesting. And a range of different businesses have been awarded funding. So it's not really industry specific. It's very broad, but focused on female founders, obviously. So keep an eye out for that one. There's industry specific grants as well. Now, these could be anything from heritage and cultural to regional development. There's Indigenous business, Indigenous tourism, there's business events. You've got things like your COVID-19 consumer travel support funding at the moment. So always keep an eye out for anything that's specific to your industry as well, because there are a lot of industry specific grants. Recently announced are the Small Business Technology Investment and also the Small Business Skills and Training Boosts. Now, these are quite new. And it's basically essentially a boost where they're offering 120% tax deduction on any funds spent in those areas. So technology investment and small business skills and training. So that's a really good opportunity for small businesses. In terms of technology investment, it's to implement technology. I believe it's also training on technology. But think about, are you going to automate something more in your business, or what investment were you going to make on technology? Because now you can get 120% tax deduction, which is pretty massive. And the same with the Small Business Skills and Training Boost, which is absolutely fantastic. Now, recently extended is the Small Business Apprenticeship Program as well. And that's where you can get wage subsidies and rebates on people that are employed by your business, called apprentices as such, but it's not a traditional apprenticeship. They do go through the apprenticeship network and get sort of registered as an apprentice, but they can just undergo training within your business. So Cert 3 and below, I believe. They sort of enroll for that training, and then you get a subsidy on their wage as a result of supporting them in that. So that's a really good opportunity as well. Okay, so now in terms of the resource areas that grants and programs are available, or how you can find more info. First of all, the best resource that I found is the grants and programs section of the business website, business.gov.au website, so the Australian Federal Government website. It has a really great grant finder tool that you can use to see what grants you might be eligible for. It does also show you any grants that have closed as well. So things like the Female Founder, you can get a bit of history on what that was about in anticipation that it may come out again in the future. There's also Grant Connect, which is the government grant information system. Now, that's more of a centralised publication or website of forecast and current Australian government grant opportunities, but also shows you grants that have been awarded. This is a really good area to have a look and just see, who has been awarded things in the past and what sort of projects have been successful, and it could help you tailor your project. Self-Start. Now, Self-Start is support for individuals through the first stages of starting their own business. And that covers sort of everything from planning and validating your idea, finding local support through to, getting your pitch right. There's a lot of information and resources under 11 different topic areas on that website. So I would have a look at that. Obviously, the COVID assistance packages, again, that's the Australian government site that will highlight any COVID government financial assistance and support packages that are or were available. EMDG I spoke about, so that's the link to get more info. That's all through Austrade. the Export Market Development Grant. You've also got research development tax incentives, and that's really to help companies innovate and grow by offsetting some of the eligible research and development costs. Landing pads is another really interesting thing to check out. Now that's market ready, or it's for market ready Australian startups and scale ups to access some, I guess it's, the world's most renowned hubs. Like there's hubs in San Francisco, Tel Aviv, Shanghai, Berlin, and Singapore, I think is the other one. What it does through landing pads, it provides you an operational base and then some customized support to help you to get overseas and really guide you through and help you with your overseas expansion goals. They did put a hold on it because there was no travel. So at one stage, they were accepting future applications only. So just check that out. I'm not too sure if that has changed. I haven't been on there recently, like in the last couple of weeks, but definitely check it out if it's of interest to you. Now, other than that, I would keep an eye out for any networking events, any other grants that are administered at a local or a shire sort of level. Business advisory services are fantastic, like the Digital Solutions Program that we're presenting this webinar to you on behalf of, which is a Commonwealth government program. Subscribe to government newsletters and that kind of thing, and then you'll always be up to date, as well as newsletters within your industry. If you've got some kind of industry membership, normally they will be communicating any grant opportunities. But just work through all of these websites to identify grant opportunities and use the process of elimination. Access to government grant finder tools and that kind of thing, and just go through and go, I've got some project ideas. Would this work? No. Would this work? No. So go through and do that process of elimination. Just a final thing, make sure you always access grants through government websites. So beware of any imitations. Now, any government website is going to have the .gov.au suffix, so don't trust any other websites for anything other than information. Now, all grant applications should be available for free. So if they are available for free, I should say. So if you're paying for access or paying for an application or anything like that, then you're being scammed. And that's kind of what the scam is that they'll say, this is the actual grant that we've got. It's a $100 application fee. You shouldn't have to pay that. Now, someone's just asked me to go back to the previous slide, so I certainly will do that. And don't forget that you'll get sent a recording of today's webinar as well. Or if you want any of these links, just let us know. But otherwise, they'll all be on the recording that gets sent through to you. So hopefully you got that information that you need, but that wraps up the session on grants for small businesses. If you are applying for anything, best of luck. I think it's a great thing to go through. There is a lot of government support at the moment, and there generally always is, so make use of it and always look out for it. If you do want any further assistance, this webinar has been brought to you as part of the Commonwealth Government Grants program, which is called Digital Solutions. So we have advisors that can work with you one-on-one on things like your grant applications, but also anything digital related. So social media, digital marketing, websites, cybersecurity, absolutely anything. And you can get up to 3 hours of mentorship for just $44, plus a range of webinars and workshops to make up, like a 7-hour package essentially. There is some eligibility around that. You do have to have an ADN registered in WA, Queensland or NT. You have to be operating for profit, and you have to employ fewer than 20 full-time staff. But otherwise, like I said, good luck if you are applying for any grant applications. I would really encourage you at the very least to get onto some of those grant finder tools and just see what might be out there for your business and take advantage of the amazing support that we've got at the moment. I will stay on for questions. So if you do have any, please shoot them through. Otherwise, hopefully we speak again soon.